When the training of a military gets worse month after month, week after week, in policy circles, we call it an organizational death spiral. Is Russia caught in its own death spiral? Leaked calls indicate that Russia is cutting corners in the training of its troops. But just what effects does it have for those still fighting on the front line? This is some video from Insight from Ukraine and Russia. Let's get into it.
To keep its war effort, the Russian army recruits everyone it can, including alcoholics and troublemakers. Judging by the 2 intercepted phone calls you'll hear today, all the newcomers care about is where to get next drink and how to spend the quality fun time instead of how to train better before being employed to the front. So let's listen.
Okay, I want to point something out, right? Alcoholism in Russia is just something different, right? It is a tremendous problem, right? If you look here, here's a chart of alcoholism by country. This is World Alcoholism by Country 2023, right? Or, alcohol dependency disorder, if you want to get technical. This is, of course, not just measured by the number of drinks you consume, but for it to actually qualify as alcohol use disorder, you actually have to have it negatively impact your life, spending a large portion of your salary on drinks, missing work, or missing time with your family. And the impact has to be meaningful. Like, yes, technically, if you spend $13 on a cocktail and you go, oh, I can't believe I spent that. Like, we're not talking minor stuff. We're talking about real substantial impacts to your life. So the fact is, this isn't a measure of per capita drinking. It's a measure of people who are drinking to the point where their lives begin to fall apart. And in case you can't notice from this chart, the United States, right, clocking in at a fairly high 17% of males actually suffering from alcohol dependency disorder. That's 1 in 6 for those of you keeping score at home. But Russia dwarfing the US of A with a absolutely eye-watering 36% of males. Guys, that means 1 in 3 Russians struggle to function because of their use of alcohol. So I want you to place that in a context when you imagine the military of a country made up of almost a majority of alcoholics. For comparison, guys, Ukraine, about 12% of males, 11.5% of males. So I want to point out the country's basically being carried, Russia, by women, because females, 7.4%, males, 36%, right? So it's almost unconceivable, right? In the US, right, it's much closer. It's like 10% female, 17% male. So men are like 50% higher. But here men are 4-5 times, more than 5 times as likely as women to become alcoholics. So just keep that in mind when you hear these stories.
To the Russian soldier who's already close to the front and who's dreaming about getting wasted at home in Russia.
У тебя в феврале будет неделька свободная?
Я так 3 года уже делаю.
Ну все, значит, в феврале неделю в запой идем. Я просто...
Wow. Okay, guys, I want to point out a $3,000 bender. Okay, that is a massive. That is a bender in the developed world, in Europe, right? The fact that you can spend $3,400 in Russia, that's like saying you're going to have like a $10,000 vacation. At that point, this is more than drinking he's planning on doing. That to me says there's going to be drug use. There might be, I'm trying to think of how to not get demonetized. Women whose company you pay for, very fancy hotels, right? This is clearly someone who's got a hole burning in his pocket. And the funny thing is that historically, right, in the US, when I was deployed, we had R&R, right? You would send soldiers home and they would fly them home and they would get 2 weeks back in the States. If soldiers, for example, had a child, they would try to send them there, get them home a week before and a week after their due date so they could meet their child. But for a lot of soldiers, that was just the opportunity to go party, right? That's what I did. But 3,000? No, I got 2 nights in a nice hotel in Philly and went to like a couple of bars. Like, and it wasn't that fun, honestly. It was kind of weird and sad. I had way more fun just like hanging out with my parents and getting pizza. But the takeaway from this is an absolutely eye-watering amount.
Планирую там 1300 бахать.
Ты чё? Что надо покупать такого?
Вот. Отпускники вернулись. Один отпускник вообще почти там.
By vacationers, I think he's referring to Russian soldiers returning from R&R.
Вот это
Просто
да.
2 недели без пробов. Ночью сегодня с РСЗО 20.
Отправил бы им этот самолетик с надписью «Уже прекращайте, дайте отдохнуть». У вас что, как там, командующий все такой же, этот судимый? Не, подождите.
Да забей.
Interesting. Says their do you still have the same commander, the one who's been convicted? This may be a reference to some level of misbehavior. That's what I think, or possibly even desertion, because oftentimes, right, what we've talked about for Russia is that they have a real lack of qualified specialists, right? They need qualified tank operators, artillerymen, mechanics, and officers. There's some rumors that the Russian officer corps has been just devastated. So if you're a qualified officer and you try to flee, your punishment may just be like, hey, Russia says, go back and continue to do your job, jerk. Oh, shoot. Oh, gosh. How'd I do that? Okay, let's see. There you go.
С одной стороны, я вот тоже понимаю. Мы типа контрактники, а с подготовкой в скобочках нет.
Ну и да, есть.
Okay, he's talking about contract soldiers, and we've talked about this in other videos. There's increasingly in this war a two-tiered system. There's contract soldiers, and these are soldiers who were trained oftentimes in peacetime. Oftentimes they have maybe prior combat service or some other level of Russian military service or professional or time in the professional Russian military. Generally, not always, obviously, but generally, these are seen as professional troops. They are often given specialty jobs, handling more sophisticated missions. On the other hand, you have mobilized soldiers. These are soldiers who were forced to rejoin the military. They're often conscripts who are technically in the reserve, the Russian reserve, who get sort of forcibly mobilized. They don't come of their own volition. And because they are looked down on by contract soldiers, they're given, and because their training can be often extremely limited, they are given missions which are extremely simple and extremely dangerous, generally frontal assaults. And they're treated very badly, oftentimes treated like conscripts often were in the old Soviet system of the Afghan war, where you have these troops, these low-skill troops who are just so abused. Oftentimes their personal possessions are stolen. Oftentimes for even things like food or shelter, they're forced to pay their superiors or contract soldiers who will hold things like a sleeping bag hostage. They'll say, I took your sleeping bag. If you want it back, you have to get me a bottle of vodka or 1,000 rubles. And if you're a mobilized soldier, no one wants to help you, right? They don't want to run afoul of these contract soldiers who are treated by the system as more valuable because, frankly, they are more valuable. They're highly trained soldiers, whereas you're just cannon fodder. So this sort of split is very common. Now, obviously, as we talked about, contract soldiers, it's not necessarily true, right? And don't get me wrong, just because you've completed professional military training, surprise, surprise, doesn't make you a super stud hero genius.
Такое.
Мы же полигон по целых 2-3 рожка отстреливаем, и все, готовы, нас сюда отправляют. А он с такими работает. Я подписывал контракт, написано 3 месяца подготовки. 6 дней, сука, 6 дней. 2 из которых мы едем.
Yeah, this is always brilliant. 3 months of training. Yeah, I mean, and this is one of those things that is sort of bothersome because, like, you can't sue the Russian government, right? Like when you have an autocratic society where everyone answers to Putin, contracts, rules, the rules are just a tool. They're just a tool to allow people like Putin or the people in charge to create the things they want, right? It gives the average person a sense of order, a sense of rules, but it doesn't actually it's no different than if Putin or the Kremlin was to simply point and say, you go to the front lines. You have 2 days of training, right? But that would make people mad. It's sort of like where you call customer service. Let's say your bank has made a mistake and you say, hey, I need you to reverse this mistake. The person goes, I'm sorry, we can't do that. You're like, well, what do you mean? You're the bank. You can do anything you want. It's your system. And they go, well, we have policies, we have rules that say we can't do this. And it's like, you wrote the rules as the bank. You can change these policies. You can reverse a transaction or correct your mistake. Nothing is stopping you. You know, airlines, another example, right? But so you write these rules in order to impose your will and abdicate responsibility for actually doing things, right? Again, this is Putin's way of saying, and the Kremlin's way of saying, oh, well, the rules, contracts are the contracts. And I'm sure somewhere in the contract it says any one of these terms can be changed based on the needs of the military. And they just do, right? In the US, again, we have a justice system that has these neutral judges that have some authority to make the government do this thing or that thing. It's not perfect. Government still does exactly these things, you know, invents rules just to coerce little people into pretending like they're not being bossed around. But, you know, prisons, for example, the Bureau of Prisons works like this. But Russia, the whole country is just run in that same way.
Группник как раз это устроился на подработку благодаря матери. Там они какие-то платы для дронов делают. Не знаю, куда эти дроны отправляются, но могу догадываться.
Куда? А куда? У нас нету. У хохлов больше дронов, чем людей, а где они? У нас на той неделе 18 хохлячек сбили. У нас, не знаю, штук 5, наверное.
This is fascinating to me. 18 drones, which to me, that says that these drones are being used more and more like swarms. We're seeing it now, right? We're seeing where Ukrainian forces just yesterday, for example, threw 40 drones at a handful, 4 targets in Crimea, with the expectation that there would be 90% of these drones would be shot down, but that a few would get through. And the fact that they're cheap, unsophisticated drones meant that they were successful. 4 did indeed, I think 7 was the number. 7 successfully made it through Russian air defenses and took out actually Russian radar and Russian anti-air systems, which is convenient because it means the next wave of drones, maybe 20% will make it through. But this is one of the things that a lot of people fear. And as these drones get more advanced, you'll be able to create bigger swarms that function more autonomously, right? You'll be able to give the drones more general guidance about what targets to hit, where they need to go. And I know you're like, oh, it's going to end in Skynet. And I kind of remind people, it's like, listen, human beings have the capacity to do all of these things. It's just drones are going to make it cheaper and easier to do, right? Like, again, the fear is not that the intelligence will level up. The fear is that the access to a rudimentary intelligence will become widespread, right? Again, don't worry about, the fear should not be, is the drone going to become smarter than all humans combined? Probably not. But is the fear that a drone that's smart enough to do rudimentary target identification, rudimentary navigation, respond to threats in a basic way, is that going to be provided to every state, every .com, every NGO? And what are they going to do with that power? That's what keeps me up at night with these drones.
Верят в то, что если воевать по старинке, это сработает, и я не понимаю этого.
According to the official Russian stats, there were at least 1.2 million registered alcoholics in Russia before the war. But in 2022, the alcohol sales increased by 7.5%. I imagine that...
Whoa, guys. Annual consumption, wow, is 13 liters of vodka per human, right? Per man, woman, and child. If you assume that, a third of Russians, you can just dismiss because they're probably children below drinking age, that means that the actual number of drinkers is probably 26 liters of vodka per year, which is absolutely insane. Like 26 liters is, let's see, 26 liters to gallon. Sorry, I'm an American. I'm dumb. Okay, 25 liters is about 6 gallons. 6 gallons of liquor. Guys, that is tremendous, especially because it is, by the way, the actual alcohol, right? Not, for example, don't be like 6 gallons of wine. That's not that much, right? Remember, it's the actual alcohol. So even if you're drinking pretty strong, let's say you're drinking 100 proof whiskey, right, or 100 proof liquor, that's 50% alcohol, 50% other stuff. That means it's 12 gallons of vodka per year, which means what's that work out to? A gallon of vodka a month? That's like scary. That's a scary level of alcohol consumption.
In 2023, this uptrend of alcohol consumption hasn't stopped. And the actual numbers are much higher than that because the official stats don't include Russian soldiers who get wasted all the time on the occupied territories. And if you still think that it's some kind of propaganda that Russian soldiers are all sober and they never get wasted, then just listen to this next intercepted phone call in which the Russian soldier somewhere in the training center tells about what's going on there.
Алло, Славан, здорово, Толян. Нормально, ты как? Ну, маленький хера напивал. Сегодня похмелился уже. Да, чуть-чуть. Да, сегодня похмелился. Ну, числа 18 стартуем вроде. Примерно, да, в Херсонском направлении. Куда? А, Запорожье, понял. Понял. Я там, да? А было сколько? Ну, вы с ДНРовцами работаете, это их схема.
Oh, well, the DPR, you guys know, when it benefits Russia, the DPR is a completely separate entity, not associated with the Russian government at all. Likely that's what they're going to say when DPR veterans try to claim service, right? Service disability or service pensions. But for purposes of command and control, the DPR has been absorbed entirely by the Russian military. And technically, according to Russia, the occupied Ukraine is Russian territory. And oftentimes, and almost all of the DPR soldiers are Russian passport holders. So again, this is just a classic example of the games. The government plays whatever games it wants to create the situation that benefits it. Absolutely. This is just par for the course. And I find it fascinating because in the U.S., you look at some of these stories about this guy drinking in his basic training. In the U.S., you are not allowed to drink when you are on deployment, period, full stop, non-negotiable. You are not allowed to drink when you are in basic training, period, full stop. You're not allowed to drink when you are on duty in any capacity, right, including field exercises or training exercises. And so it wasn't uncommon to have soldiers who would go, not uncommon, it was basically expected that you would do, in the course of potentially up to 15 months, right? Because National Guard soldiers would be activated. They would have a 3-month training cycle. Then they would deploy for 12 months, and then they would come back. In that 15 months, there would be only a 2-week window when they were on R&R when they would be allowed to drink, which again, like for a lot of Americans who there's limited alcohol consumption, for a lot of Americans, not a big deal. But again, 1 in 6 men are alcoholics. So, you factor that in, and I've known plenty of soldiers, plenty of officers who functioned fine, did their jobs, were good performers, and would get blackout drunk. I'd see them the next day if I bumped into them like socially in the evening or out at a bar or restaurant, and we would have a conversation. We'd be polite. And then the next day I would ask them about it. I'd be like, hey, how was so-and-so? And they'd look at me. They'd be like, what are you talking about? And I'd say, well, we hung out last night. I said hi to you at, you know, you know, Johnny's or whatever. And they'd be like, what? I was like, yeah, you were out. You were drinking. We had a conversation. And they would just look at me. And I was like, oh my God, you were blackout drunk at the time. It would be scary, man. It would be spooky, honestly. But just imagine 1 in 3 men living their lives like that.
Oh, that's...
And then having them go to war, right? You would just have withdrawals. And I'm sure National Guard soldiers, I'm sure a lot of our soldiers also just really struggled, probably low key. I imagine they probably may have seen the medics or something like that to make it through their alcohol withdrawal.
Ну, ага. Окружить? И чё? Это вы сейчас, что ли, там? Ага. А чё, сильно, чё тебя...
Oof, sounds like this dude, his friend is giving him more reasons to drink. Surrounded? Hit by a grenade? Are you there now?
Гранаты чем там, осколками или чё? Это сильно кроет, да? Там у них тоже, то есть, не то, что это расслабух, там вообще потом.
Yeah, it sounds like he's talking about not Zaporizhzhia, but probably around the Kherson region himself. Right? When he says it's not a walk in the park for them either, they're getting hammered. This is a reference probably to the beachheads that the Ukrainian forces are trying to hold.
Да? Понял. Откатил, как вы противостоите сейчас. Ну, а вы смотри, у тебя вообще какое подразделение, не пойму? Storm. Нет, а вообще чем, там, допустим, вот у нас Storm.
Oh, he's a Storm soldier, right? Storm Zs are a classic example of those conscript units we talked about, or these mobilized units. They are frontal assault units. They're meant to conduct very low-skilled light infantry assaults, and they're the ones who actually take the territory, but oftentimes higher-skilled soldiers will not sit in the back, but they will perform specialty roles. Like, for example, they'll be the armored crew that engages at a greater distance, tank operators, tank crews, armored vehicle crews, MLRS system crew, mortar crews, right? All of them require months of specialized training, and Russia basically needed to find a strategy that was going to enable them to make it worth it to train these crews, right? Because you can't, let's say you train a mortar crew and then you have them go forward with the infantry and they get killed. You go, great, we just spent 3 months training this mortar crew, and they're gone already. So you have to find a way to preserve your specialists but still take territory. And what they settled on was this strategy where light infantry conduct a frontal assault into areas that have been prepared with fires. So artillery crew, tank crews, MLRS teams, mortar crews, they just blanket an area with fire. I'm simplifying it. The tactics are a little more sophisticated. They blanket the area with fire, and then they tell these low-skill conscripts, all right, walk in and take the territory. And sometimes ideally, the Ukrainians already withdraw, and so these low-skill infantry just occupy trenches that have been just pounded by artillery, and the enemy is withdrawn from it, or the enemy is not in a position to fight in any meaningful way. But of course, the reality, as we've talked about, has been that oftentimes these Storm Z units that form these frontal infantry attack units, they just fare badly. They just lack the skill. The artillery, the MLRS systems, they're not as effective as Russia believes they are, and Ukrainians stay in their positions and then fight.
3 взвода. Вот рота, да, у нас. 3 взвода. Счет, вот огневая поддержка. Вот я сейчас с БТРа, перевели меня на УАЗик на огневую поддержку, вот эти у нас там всякая утес.
Right. So he says this guy is probably a specialist. So he says, I got transferred from the APC, the Armored Personnel Carrier, to the UAZ in a fire support squad. I think a UAZ, I think it's like an MRAP. I think it's their armored car. He also says that we have all sorts of stuff, an SV machine gun, grenade launchers, and anti-tank guided missiles, which says to me that this guy probably was identified as being a little too skilled to be a Storm Z, a frontal assault trooper. So he gets pulled, or no, actually says he got transferred from an APC. So he was probably always in a support unit, but he was an APC crew member. Then he ends up being an MRAP crew member, and then in a fire support squad, right? That's what we talked about. They're the guys in the back. And you see, these are all the things, right? A long-range machine gun, grenade launchers, ATGMs. Those are all the things they're using to soften Ukrainian positions before the low-skill infantry push into them.
Но у нас штурм, тут у нас полк дивизии. Ну, штурмовой полк, штурмовой. Не штурм, а штурм. Да я понял уже. Только вот таких, как ты, только таких.
Right. This is a contract soldier. They're more specialists.
Таких, как ты, я тебе скажу, здесь прямо единица. Представляешь, остальной контингент. Вот помнишь школу, который у нас был с нами, который все, выходил, падал. Ну вот, 80%. Я тебе клянусь.
Okay, I'm going to share this story. When I first joined the military at probably 18, one of the things my dad warned me, he actually sat me down and he was like, Paul, you have to understand that you like working, my dad knows me. He's like, listen, you like working with other people who are like you, reliable, hardworking, focused, right? You say you're going to do something and then you do it. He goes, Paul, in the military, you're going to get some people like that, but a lot of them are not going to be like that. They're going to be unreliable. They're going to be stupid. They're going to be undependable. They're going to be lazy. Like, you're going to have these people and you're going to have to work with them. You're going to have to find ways to work with them. And he was right. It was obviously the most aggravating part, because obviously when you're a hard worker and you're focused and you can think through something, it means that you do 80% of the work, and the laziest people get to be lazy, and the hardworking people have to work even harder. So I always used to joke that in our company, the company's operations were basically conducted by about 20 people, about 20 to 50 reliable soldiers, and the remaining, there were about 100 to 120 who were like marginal, go along with the flow, don't make trouble, not going to work one fraction of an inch harder than they have to. And then there were about 30 who were like actively trying to sabotage the unit's ability to do things. But yeah, I really learned something about people, about the public.
Я тебе клянусь. Мне работа наводчика доволен с этим, с командиром водителя. Ну, видать, торчок раньше был. Короче, дебилоиды прям конченые. Я говорю, я с ними куда поеду.
Yeah, he's in an MRAP. I think he must be in an MRAP, because again, a spotter would be like a gunner, and then a driver commander. So I think he means like a TC, or he's the TC, like a driver. Yeah, I guess like maybe it's a Russian translation, like the vehicle commander, like the person who operates the vehicle. That's my guess, a driver operator.
Они отучены, все. Да, куда?
They're all trained. Yeah, that's how I felt sometimes. So, okay, when I arrived in Afghanistan, we had never seen an MRAP before, ever. They were too new. We had never encountered one. We first fell in on one at Bagram Airfield, and my soldiers got 2 days of training on their MRAPs. And then they're like, great, you're certified. Congratulations, your drivers. Sign this form. All right, I've added MRAP to your driver's license. Now take these to combat. It was insane. And believe it or not, they actually made the soldiers drive these MRAPs from Bagram Airfield to Jalalabad city, literally halfway across the country in a big fucking convoy, having been in country for literally like 48 hours. And the war had been going on for 10 years at this point. So this was a huge problem, right? There was a system, and the U.S. was like, hey, when you're new in country, you fall in on a unit, you shadow that unit for a week, then you take over, and the outgoing unit like mentors you for the remaining week, and then the outgoing unit leaves and you fly solo, because that is a safety thing. It's just too idiosyncratic. Fighting a war is just too idiosyncratic to just dump a sector onto a unit. But, there's the ideal and there's the realities of war. And the realities of war were that we needed to get those MRAPs to J-Bad City and then on to what initially was called Cop Bulldog in I think it was in Bodycott district. But the point is, it was an absolute fucking disaster. It was a total nightmare. It didn't end in disaster. It was a disaster because it incurred a whole bunch of risk to our soldiers that they should never have had. They should never have been asked to do that, right? There was absolutely the soldiers and the capacity in theater to not impose that on a unit that just hit the ground. But you know what? MPs, this is like a Tuesday for us. This is what the fundamental nature. It's why I have so much branch loyalty, because dealing with like, it's just like in a day job. You got to call on the radio. You get in your patrol car. You go. Maybe you got told it was 2 spouses fighting, and when you get there, it's way worse. It's some crazy situation, and you just have to roll with it. And that's what we expect of our privates on not day one, but on their first patrol. They need to be able to deal with the craziest thing. So we got into set country. We got told some crazy stuff, and we're like, all right, let's do it.
Только нас, понимаешь, не вывозят, а среди нас в увал не отпускают, потому что боятся, что запятисотится. И опять же, пьяные. Ну тут, и уже, да, ты вот понимаешь, что дело. Я вот был в одной роте, был в одном взводе, короче, в взводе обеспечения, там, КамАЗ Урал, потом на Беттер.
A KAMAZ Ural is like a big 5-ton truck.
И, короче, меня с этого в другую роту, и, короче, вот это движение, я учусь там. А сейчас меня перекину 2 дня назад в этот, говорит, пойдешь на это, еще пойду. Ну, у меня обзор хоть видно, нахуй, там, в этой коробке не хватит. Ну, да, я был на БТРе, сейчас я на УАЗик, на пикап с этими, как это называть, это.
Yeah, he jokingly calls a UAZ, or what we would call like an MRAP, a pickup with an AGS, automatic grenade system, an automatic grenade launcher. Listen, don't kid yourself, guys. Yeah, relative to an APC, an MRAP's kind of light, but an MRAP can go a lot of places. It's not that heavy. And you put a Mark 19 on it, that thing's some fire support. That thing can mess some people up. And what makes it special is that it can go anywhere. It can go anywhere you want it to.
АГС, что ли, как он там? Патриот, да, да. Огневая поддержка.
Oh my God. I was wrong. It literally is a pickup. No way. That's the Patriot? Oh my God, guys. Jesus. Ugh. It literally is a pickup. Oh my God, the fucking Russians. Never change, guys. Never change. This is insane.
Ну, а эти остались вот там, кто с тобой приезжал, что, как там?
Okay, this is, all right, he's talking about his wife. All right, man, this phone call goes on and on and on. I got to call it there, guys. This has already been just absolutely mind-blowing. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to our sponsor. And I will see you guys in the next one. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. Cheers.